Okay, so a lot of you guys have asked me, and here it is. This is the armor stacking Berserker build guide. This is going to be a long video. I'm going to get into in-depth detail about everything you need to know about this build, which is why I'm going to leave timestamps in the description, so if you want to check out a specific part of the video or there's a specific aspect of this build that you don't understand, just go to the description and click on the part of the video that you want to see. Now, quick disclaimer, this build is not new player friendly. This is not something that you can start the game with. This is not a league starter build. This is a very end game, very expensive build. However, at high investment, this build is practically unkillable, and it does anywhere between 1 to 3 billion DPS depending on your investment. My current state of my build is at this point at about 6 to 700 million DPS. Now, why are we doing armor stacking? Why is it so good, and why does it do so much damage? The main reason for armor stacking is that you have these very specific uniques in the game, mainly your necklace, which has this mod, and your weapons, which both have this mod on it, that scale your damage through the roof the more armor you have, and you can easily get to 1 million armor with this build. So once you do the math on this, the numbers are absolutely insane. I'm currently at 1 million armor, as you can see, but I could fairly easily get to about 1.4, 1.5 million. Now, the build plays much like a lot of other Berserker builds that are being played right now. It's a Whirlwind build that leaps around. You're using Bloodthirst and Bull's Rage. Same thing with all the other builds. It's just being scaled differently. So if you're, if you've played Fire Conversion or Lightning Conversion, this is fairly similar in playstyle. In fact, it's actually the exact same playstyle. It just scales a lot differently and a lot harder than a lot of those other builds do. Now, I did mention that this build is not new player friendly. The reason for that is that a lot of the items that you need to get the build to a functional state are very expensive. These items, I mean, if you wanted to get a very basic set of these items, it's going to cost you about 1500 FE, and obviously if you're a new player, you're not going to have all that, and this build doesn't work unless you have these very specific items, which I'm going to get into in a little bit. So as I said before, we're using Whirlwind, and we're using these support skills with Whirlwind, and the reason for using these is because they're simply the most amount of damage, right? There's not much else to it. You just want to copy these. There's nothing else better besides these abilities or these support skills for Whirlwind. And then for you always want to have a defensive skill. I'm personally using Resurrection Warcry because of my belt that I'll show you later. But if you don't have the belt that I have, you would want to use Life Force, right? This is also fairly basic stuff. And then you have your general Bloodthirst and Bull's Rage setup. You would just want to use, once again, want to copy what I'm doing. Extended duration, Bloodbath, Mania. Bloodbath is probably the most important one for Bloodthirst because this will increase the effect by about 40%. And then make sure that you have cost conversion, because with the amount of mana we have sealed, we actually wouldn't really be able to cast this normally. Now, as far as Bull's Rage goes, you just want to copy this, and then if you have an extra link, you would want to use Soul Focus. It's just more effect. And then for Leap, once again, copy this. Getting getting hardened is really important because it gives you an extra layer of defense, minus 25% damage taken. You want to use Mark because it's an actual insane amount of damage. Quick mobility for more mobility, right? And then if you happen to have the 6 link for this, there's a very good skill here, which is called periodic burst, is actually insanely underrated. This will give you plus 25% attack speed for 2 seconds every 6 seconds. So this is actually fairly useful. You could put that in as your 6th kind of slot in here. Now, moving on to the auras, you want to use a curse on hit vulnerability, because vulnerability reduces physical damage taken on the enemy, and we're doing physical damage, right? Makes sense. And then you would want to seal it on life, because we don't have the mana to seal it on mana. So you want to make sure that you have this seal conversion on as well. As far as this setup goes, once again, sealing this on life, steadfast for armor, because this is actually a lot of damage for us. And then we have magical source for mana regen, because our mana regen is actually quite bad, and I find that sometimes I actually run out of mana because we have increased mana cost on our boots, which makes us kind of run out of mana a little bit faster, right? Moving on to auras, these are the 3 main auras that we're using: weapon amplification and acuteness for as much physical damage as possible, and then elemental resistance, because we need more elemental resistance, right? We don't have a whole lot on our gear. In fact, we have 1 piece of gear that actually gives any ele res, so it's very important that you get this. Without this, the build is pretty much unplayable. Okay, so moving on to talents, I'm just going to scroll through each of these talents and just kind of let you copy it. A lot of these are just kind of general damage nodes and armor nodes and health nodes. There's not really a whole lot that goes into this. This is very straightforward. A lot of this doesn't really require any explanation. The only one that I wanted to highlight was actually this one, because this is actually a lot of defense for you, a lot of recovery for you, because you do end up taking a lot of severe injuries, which a severe injury is a hit that reduces more than 35% of your health. So this will kind of help you regain a lot of that health. Another thing that is very important is this physical damage, armor, ignore, and paralysis kind of mini tree here. You always want to make sure that you get this, because paralysis is an extra 10% more damage. Now, moving on to these keystones, really the only one with this first one is going to be brutality. These other 2 are kind of garbage. The second keystone here would be endless fervor, because we need to have fervor stacks in order to generate crit rating, because we don't get any more crit rating from any of our other pieces of gear or really any of the other talents. There's some crit rating nodes, but this is the bulk of your crit rating. Our next tree is going to be Ronin, and this is actually a very straightforward tree. You obviously want to make sure that you take these armor nodes, because that's the most of our damage. You don't want to take this one because it's garbage, so you can use this point for something else. And then this is also fairly important. I found that this is actually a decent amount of damage, so make sure to pick this one up as well. And then as far as your keystones go, I like to call these keystones, I don't know what they're called, but it's kind of what they're called in PoE, so that's why I call them. Make sure you go with Sprinkle. This is just going to give you a lot of radius and extra damage. And then with the other one, just go with Falling Leaves or Trade-Off. Now there's a point in time where you would want to go with Trade-Off, and that's when you don't have an Infinity Belt with Trade-Off. Now once you have an Infinity Belt with Trade-Off on it, then you would switch to Falling Leaves. Our last tree is going to be the Brave. Now this tree is actually insane in terms of damage and survivability. There's a lot of nodes here that are very important for you to pick up. Mainly, obviously, a lot of these armor nodes are incredibly important for your scaling. Make sure to pick this up. This is very important to fix your fire res and this will give you 8 elemental res. This is pretty much the only reason we're taking this. You would be taking this even if it didn't give life. That's how good this is. And then you would want to make sure that you pick up these 6 points right here, because this will make sure that you're generating those tenacity blessings, and each stack of tenacity blessing will give you 1% additional armor, which is just even more damage. And then obviously you would want this one as well. This is a very important 4 points right here for the armor, and then the elemental and erosion resistances. And then you would want to grab these 5. Make sure that you don't grab this one, because our chest has actually no armor, so this does nothing for us. This is a useless point. Do not fall into the trap of picking this. Make sure that you just put this in some of the other nodes that I highlighted. And then moving on to the keystones, resolve is the only option here, so just grab resolve because of the tenacity blessings giving more armor and just having more tenacity blessings in general. And then you have ember armor, which converts elemental damage taken into physical damage, which is why it's actually not that big of a deal that we don't have fully capped resistances. This kind of helps you offset that fact. And that's pretty much it for the talents. Just make sure that you do 1-to-1 what I'm doing. I found that this is the best tree, and I also talked to a lot of other guys that were using this build, and this is pretty much what everybody else is using. Okay, so moving on to these hero traits, you actually want to grab increased critical damage and melee knockback supports. These are just simply the best ones. And then you just want to copy these. There's not much explanation going on here. This is pretty standard for pretty much every single build, except for maybe the 62 tree. People typically take this one, Boiling Anger, but we're actually taking Tunnel Vision because most of our damage is coming from Burst. So just make sure that you have Tunnel Vision on instead of Boiling Anger. So moving on to the pact spirits, this is actually a fairly important part of the build because this will help you get a lot of resists. So I kept the baseline elemental resists up here. This is 20%. This is going to be vital for your survivability. And then I just kind of took this guy for attack damage, double damage. This is probably not the best pet to use, but I don't really have good pets, so I'm just using this one. And then I took this rare otter because he also gives elemental resists, and I found that this is probably better than taking more damage, because you don't really need more damage. You're kind of struggling on resistances, especially early on in your build. And then my last pet is just all damage. This is all attack damage, crit rate, and attack speed. So not much to really go into here, but just make sure that you get as much elemental resist out of the pact spirit system as possible. So any pact spirit that you have that gives you any sort of elemental resist, just make sure that you use those because they are going to be best in slot. Up next is going to be the equipment / items. This is the most important part of this build, so just make sure that you pay attention because there's very important specific mods on these items that you need to be paying attention to, and you need to make sure that you have the right amount of these because it can drastically change your scaling. Now our helmet is going to be Dragon Guardian's Face Guard. This is the best helmet we can use because it has the armor implicit, and then you would just want to get triple armor for the prefixes, and then lightning, cold, and erosion res for the suffixes or postfixes, should I say. The reason you want specifically lightning, cold, and erosion res is because we're getting an excess amount of fire res from our tree or from our talents, right? And so This will make sure that we're kind of even on our resistances, and then obviously we're getting armor because we're scaling off of armor, we're scaling our damage off of armor. Now this extra armor node is actually kind of tricky to get. You need the ominous ember craft, so you need to have 6 mods on the item, and you need to have an ominous ember and then 20 FE for each try to get this mod. It's very expensive, which is why I opted to just buy this outright. This cost me about 220 FE, I believe. But obviously if you were to corrode this, you would be looking for the extra armor and the percent armor to be elevated. And by the way, before I go any further, just make sure that whenever you're corroding your items for this build, almost always corrode them with familiar nexus so that you have a higher chance of landing the mods that you actually want. Now next up we have the chest piece. This is the centerpiece of the entire build. This is what the entire build kind of revolves around. Obviously you're getting 50% defense, which is 50% extra armor. Enlarges physique. This is actually kind of an important one because this stacks up to 5 times, so this will allow you to, while you're mapping, you're gonna be covering the entire screen with your Whirlwind, so you're just gonna be one-tapping the entire screen. Now pay attention to this line here. This additional defense is actually massive for your scaling here. If you look at this, this actually goes from 15 to 17. You always want to make sure that you get one that says 17%, because just a 1% decrease in this, so if this was a 16% additional defense, this would be like a 14% damage loss. So you know, you want to make sure that you always have the 17%er. And moving on to some of these other items, this is where you're getting a lot of your life. Now this particular chest piece is nowhere near perfect. Obviously it's actually fairly bad because I only have a 4% maximum life. You would obviously want a 6% maximum life one, and then you would want to make sure that this is 4% elemental resist, because you're losing elemental resist for each legendary item that you have on, and we have 9 legendary items on, so I'm actually losing a lot of resist. I'm losing 54% elemental resist from this single item, but trust me, it's worth it. And then your last mod right here is just a layer of defense that you have, so you're immune to curses, you got spell block, and then your skill cost is reduced. You pretty much get this all the time because we're pretty much using all uniques. So just make sure that this build does not function without this item. There's no substitutes for this. Now moving on to our necklace, we are actually using the Forlorn Crystal. This is obviously the best item for armor scaling because it gives us all the stats that we want. Now pay attention to this mod right here, the physical damage dealt by attacks per 20,000 armor. This is insane amounts of damage for your build, so this is why this is a very good item, right? Now this is actually a really cheap item baseline because people are reselling their corrupted ones, because people are trying to get this mod to be elevated. This item with this elevated mod is actually about 500 to 600 FE, so it is actually fairly expensive. This one with the double elevated mod with the 30% life is probably around 800. And the reason you would want this elevated physical damage mod is because this is around an extra 50% of your damage if you get this mod elevated compared to the baseline version of the mod, right? Because the baseline version is 10 to 30, the elevated, as you can see, is 20 to 40. And the way this is calculated, this is actually, you know, comes out to about 50% more damage once you have this mod, which is why it's so expensive, right? This could actually be one of the first things that you're trying to min-max or trying to obtain, is an elevated version of this necklace. Next up, we have our gloves, and these gloves are fairly simple. It's just armor, fire res, life, all stats, and then you have life regain and more life regain. There's not really a whole lot to go into here. It's very obvious why this is good. If you were to corrode this, you would be looking for the increased gear armor, the percentage one, or the increased life regain, either one of these to be elevated, because that's way more survivability. Getting this 109 gear armor elevated is not that much damage, it's not that important, so it's probably best to just get more recovery. Now, I talked about the belt briefly in some of the previous segments, but here it is. This is the belt that I'm using. Now, this is pretty much just a 3 stat belt, maybe a 4 stat belt if you count this. This energy shield is a dead stat. This doesn't do anything for us, but the trade-off keystone is actually really good. As I said, you would take this on the talent tree, but since I have it here, I just take falling leaves instead. And then you want defense, obviously, for more armor, and then you would go with further effect because this will give you way more crit rate. And then I went with Warcry immediate cast with another charge to my Warcry, which is why I'm personally using Resurrection Warcry instead of the other defensive skill that I mentioned in the skills section. So just try and aim for something like this. This cost me about 200, I think 250 FE. It wasn't that expensive, but once this build kind of starts taking off and people catch on, something like this might be a lot more expensive. Okay, so I forgot to mention this, but this is actually pretty important. If you're struggling with elemental resist on your character, make sure that you get an infinity that has the plus 21 elemental resistances stat on it. This is all resist, so this will be lightning, cold, and fire resist. This will help you out a lot. I don't have it, and my character would be way tankier if I did have it. That's just something to keep in mind. Also, if you're still struggling with resist, you can also opt for a crafted belt with tier 1 elemental resist and tier 1 erosion res. What that will do is it will make you way tankier, but at the cost of damage, right? You're not gonna get the defense, you're not gonna get the fervor effect that I mentioned, and you're not gonna get something like the trade-off notable or keystone that will give you a lot more damage, but it will make you a lot tankier. So that's something to keep in mind. Now, moving on to boots. These are probably the most important pieces of gear that you can get because obviously the insane amount of armor this gives you. You don't care about anything minion related on this. So the synthetic troop and movement speed, you don't care about this. It's kind of garbage. Minion level. What you care about is the percent gear armor. This can roll from 5 to 600, so you would obviously want something that rolls as close to 600 as possible. And then when you're corroding this item, once again with a familiar nexus, you would be looking for the percent gear armor and maybe the percent life or maybe the percent movement speed, but obviously mainly the gear armor. And I will get into how good these elevated items are once we get through all of these all of these pieces of gear that I have on me right now. So another thing that I forgot to mention about these boots is that when you're corroding these, it's important to be on the lookout for the minion level mod, this one, and the synthetic troop quantity mod, because the best minion builds in the game, right? They all use these boots, and so they are all looking for these two mods to be elevated, right? So if you happen to get those mods, these boots can actually sell for if you just have one, it'll probably sell for about 500, but if you happen to have both synthetic troop and minion skill level, then I've seen these sell for like 2000 FE, so it's very important that you're on the lookout for these, which is why it's actually more cost effective for you to actually corrupt these yourself. An uncorrupted version of these boots is about, I've seen them go as low as 130, but they're typically around like 150. You can buy corroded versions of these for as low as 70 though. I typically resell these for about 100 to 105 once I corrode them. I haven't managed to land the gear armor, but I'm currently working on it. Now for your rings, both ring sockets are going to use, or ring slots are going to be using the same ring, Elemental Rain. This is actually a very cheap ring, and even the armor corroded versions are like 10 FE, so this is probably the easiest thing for you to pick up early on, and this will just give you a bunch of stats that you need. And actually the flat life on these is really good because of how much percent life we're getting from this and then from the tree. Those things will help scale this flat life a lot better. Okay, so as for our weapons, we're using Supremacy's Forge in both hands. Now the reason is that this is actually the best weapon for armor scaling builds because of this mod at the very end. And this is actually the mod that you would want to be elevated if you were corrupting these. Now you don't have to corrupt these, but this is probably like the last thing you would want to corrupt, because it's much better just to get more armor corruptions on, or corrosions on these other items. Once you have those, then this is obviously a lot more scaling, so this goes up to 3% if you were to corrode it. So yeah, that's pretty much it for the item section. Now I want to talk about why it's important that you corrupt your own items. It's much cheaper, pretty much. It's actually the odds of you corrupting a mod that you want is actually not that low, and you would always want to be corrupting with familiar nexuses. So you would go in here, click on this, and then select that, and just a random item, and you want to buy these off of the market. Now these are about 15 each, but it's well worth it, because what this does is that when you get an elevated mod, it can either be Desecration or Arrogance, and Desecration actually elevates 2 mods instead of just 1, which will, overall, if you're buying expensive bases, so for example, let's say you're trying to corrupt your chest piece, right? This chest piece, uncorrupted, is about 1200 FE. So, you would obviously want to make sure that you get as many chances for elevated mods as possible. So you might as well spend the extra 15 FE and get the Desecration on it with a higher percent chance of, rolling that elevated mod. And I just wanted to show you guys how good some of these elevated mods are. So I actually saved some of these items of note. So for example, this one has a 22% defense elevated, and as you can see, it's 88% damage. So this would probably add, like, for my build, it would add like 700 million DPS or something, like 500 million DPS. So this is obviously what you're looking for, and then maybe getting this elevated. Secondly, to lower the amount of resists that you're losing is also very important. These boots, for example, just this elevated armor mod compared to what I have is another 37% more damage, right? Hundreds of millions of damage that you're getting just from one mod being elevated. The weapon, once again, 21%, and this number would actually be a lot higher if I had these first, because obviously you have more armor, you get more of these 3% attack damage increases per 1000 armor. And then for the gloves, this is the only item that I could find that had this, the elevated armor mod, 11% damage, pretty good. So just to show you how much higher the damage scaling can actually go, billions of DPS just from these just from these 4, well 5, because you would get 2 of these, right? So just from these 5 items you could get billions of DPS, but these are obviously very expensive. And you know, as I said, you would want to be corroding these yourself, because you can resell the corroded items and it will make it so that it's a lot cheaper for you with like average RNG to get some of these items compared to buying them. Like buying this for 9,000 is probably not worth it. You can probably get this for a lot cheaper if you were to do it yourself. The odds on it are not that bad. And that's pretty much it for this build guide. If you have any questions, concerns, whatever, just make sure to leave a comment. Make sure you like or dislike the video, it doesn't really matter. And also have a Twitch account where I stream occasionally, so just follow me on Twitch, it's in the description. And also I'm planning on making a follow-up video on this sometime soon, you know, once I get better items to kind of showcase what this build looks like when you're, you know, in the billions of DPS range. I'm not quite there yet, but I'm actually quite close. So thank you all for watching and have a good rest of your day.